Under the relentless sun of the Montana Territory, Jack Sullivan rode his chestnut mare through the dusty trails of Big Sky country. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the promise of another day without rain. It had been 3 years since he'd seen his family, 3 years since he'd left to seek his fortune in the California gold fields. Now he was returning with empty pockets and a heavy heart, carrying only the scars of broken dreams. The town of Cedar Falls appeared on the horizon like a shimmering mirage. The wooden buildings clustered around Main Street, where an old Presbyterian church raised its white steeple against the unforgiving sky. Jack knew these dusty streets well. He'd grown up here, running barefoot between the general store and the schoolhouse, listening to cowboys' tales and dreaming of distant adventures. But today there was something different in the air. An unusual commotion came from the town square, where a crowd had gathered around a makeshift platform. Jack approached with curiosity, hearing fragments of conversations about a special auction. It wasn't uncommon to have auctions of cattle or land in the territory, but this seemed different. The men spoke in hushed tones with grim expressions, and the women crossed themselves discreetly. The auctioneer, a portly man with a greying moustache, climbed onto the platform brandishing a wooden gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out in a hoarse voice, "today we have special items for auction. Personal belongings, work tools, and—" he paused dramatically, "a young orphan girl to be taken in by a Christian family willing to provide shelter and proper upbringing." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Human auctions were rare, but not unheard of in these difficult times. Families destroyed by poverty sometimes had no choice but to give up their children to whoever could feed them. Still, there was something deeply disturbing about this situation. The first item auctioned was a rusty plow that went for $2. This was followed by some broken chairs, a pair of worn boots, and an old saddle. With each item sold, the tension in the crowd increased, everyone waiting for the inevitable moment. Finally, the auctioneer signaled to someone at the back of the platform. "And now, gentlemen, young Hope, 15 years old, orphaned of both parents, healthy and hard-working. Who'll start the bidding at $10? A small, frail figure was pushed forward. Jack felt the world spin when he saw the girl's face. Black hair fell over her thin shoulders, framing a face he knew all too well. The same green eyes as his sister Mary, the same delicate jawline, the same shaped eyebrows. There was no possible doubt. This was Grace, Mary's daughter, his niece, who had disappeared during the cholera epidemic 3 years earlier. Memories flooded his mind like a flash flood. Grace at 12, running through the cornfields of the family homestead, laughing as she chased chickens. Grace, helping Grandma make apple pies, with flour on her cheeks and a mischievous smile on her lips. And then, the disease that swept through the region like a hurricane, taking so many away, including Mary and her husband. Grace had disappeared during the chaos, and everyone assumed she had died too. But there she was, alive, though unrecognizable. The cheerful, plump girl had become a thin, frightened young woman, with eyes that had already seen too much suffering. Her clothes were dirty rags, her bare feet showed calluses and wounds, and there was a deep sadness in her gaze that broke Jack's heart. $10! Shouted a pot-bellied rancher from across the square. Jack knew the man, Bill Hawkins, known for mistreating his workers and having heavy hands when he drank. 15, offered another, an oily-looking merchant whom Jack knew frequented the town's saloons and worse establishments. Jack's blood boiled. His niece would not be sold like cattle to men who saw her only as property to exploit. He touched the small bag of coins in his pocket, the little money he'd managed to scrape together in recent months doing odd jobs. It wasn't much, but maybe it would be enough. $20, he called out in a firm voice, surprising himself. The crowd turned to look at him. Jack was a stranger to many, a man who had left young and returned aged by sun and hardship. His simple clothes and humble appearance didn't intimidate anyone, but there was something in his eyes that made some men step back. 25, counted Hawkins, spitting on the ground. Jack felt despair growing in his chest. He had no more than $23, and that was everything he owned in the world. But then he remembered his mother's silver locket, the only valuable thing he carried with him. Without hesitation, he pulled it from around his neck. $25 and this silver locket, he proclaimed, raising the jewelry for all to see. The auctioneer took the locket and examined it with expert eyes. Genuine silver, he announced, worth at least $5. Current bid stands at $30 equivalent. Hawkins grumbled and looked to his companions, but none seemed willing to raise the stakes. The oily merchant also withdrew from the bidding. After a few moments of tense silence, the auctioneer brought down his gavel. "Sold to Mr. What's your name, sir?" "Jack Sullivan," he replied in a hoarse voice, still barely believing what he had done. While completing the transaction, handing over his coins and precious locket, Jack couldn't take his eyes off Grace. The girl watched him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, showing no signs of recognition. 3 years was an eternity in a child's life, and she had been through ordeals Jack couldn't even imagine. When he approached her after signing the necessary papers, Grace instinctively stepped back. "Don't be afraid," Jack said quietly. "I won't hurt you. My name is Jack." The girl studied him with suspicious eyes. There was sharp intelligence in that look, but also a caution that broke Jack's heart. She had learned not to trust strangers, and he was exactly that to her now. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Hope," she whispered, using the name they had given her at the orphanage. Jack nodded, though his heart tightened hearing the false name. "That's a beautiful name. Come with me, Hope. Let's go home." The journey back to the family homestead was made in silence. Jack rode ahead while Grace sat on his mare, gripping the saddle firmly. She didn't speak, just observed the familiar landscape with eyes that showed no recognition. Trauma and time had erased her earliest memories. The old Sullivan homestead appeared at dusk, its log walls glowing golden in the sunset light. The property was in terrible condition. 3 years of abandonment had covered everything with a layer of dust and neglect. The fences were broken, the corral empty, and the main house looked like a shadow of the welcoming home it once was. Jack helped Grace dismount and led her to the porch. "This used to be your—" he began to say, but stopped himself. It wasn't the right time for revelations. The girl was exhausted, hungry, and scared. First, he needed to take care of her basic needs. "You must be hungry," he said, opening the front door. "I'll fix us something to eat." The kitchen was covered in dust, but the basic utensils were still there. Jack lit the wood stove and began preparing a simple stew with ingredients he'd brought on his journey. While cooking, he discreetly watched Grace. She had sat in a wooden chair near the window, staring fixedly at the yard where chickens used to peck. "I used to live here," Jack said casually, stirring the stew. "When I was young like you." Grace didn't respond, but Jack noticed she had tilted her head slightly, as if listening more attentively. "There was a girl here, about your age. She loved chasing chickens in the yard. She was so fast she could catch them with her bare hands." Jack smiled at the memory. Her mother always scolded her for it, but she'd laugh and keep doing it anyway. This time, Grace turned to look at him directly. There was something in her eyes, a spark of something that could be memory or just curiosity. They ate in relative silence. Jack made occasional comments about the food or small repairs he planned to make to the house, always maintaining a casual and reassuring tone. Grace ate slowly, as if not accustomed to regular meals, but cleaned her plate completely. When night fell, Jack prepared one of the bedrooms for Grace. It was Mary's old room, though he didn't mention that. He put clean sheets on the bed and lit a small candle so she wouldn't be in total darkness. "If you need anything during the night, my room is right down the hall," he said, pointing to the corridor. "Don't be afraid to call me." Grace nodded shyly and entered the room. Jack waited to hear the sound of the door closing, but it remained ajar. It was a good sign. She didn't feel completely trapped. Jack spent the night awake, planning how to gradually reveal the truth to Grace. He couldn't simply tell her he was her uncle. That might frighten her even more. He needed to earn her trust first, help her remember on her own. The following days established a gentle routine. Jack worked on the most urgent repairs to the homestead, while Grace watched from a distance. She helped with small domestic tasks, sweeping, organizing, preparing simple meals, but always remained alert, like a wild animal ready to flee. Slowly, Jack began sharing more stories about the family. He talked about his sister Mary, about how she made the best cornbread in the territory, about her infectious laugh and her kindness to all the neighbors. He mentioned Mary's husband Thomas, a gentleman who raised the finest horses in the valley. They had a daughter, he said one afternoon while mending a broken fence. A special girl with green eyes like yours. She disappeared during the epidemic. Everyone searched for her, but they never found her. Grace stopped sweeping the yard and stared at him. What was her name? Jack felt his heart race. It was the first time she had shown direct interest in one of his stories. Grace. Her name was Grace Sullivan. The broom slipped from Grace's hands and fell to the ground with a dull thud. She stood motionless for a long moment, as if something deep was stirring within her mind. I dream sometimes, she said with a trembling voice, about a woman who makes apple pies and sings old songs. And there's a man who teaches me to ride small horses. Jack dropped the tool he was holding and approached slowly. What kind of songs? Grace closed her eyes and, in an almost inaudible voice, began humming a simple melody. It was a lullaby that Mary always sang, a traditional tune their own mother had taught her. Jack felt tears burn his eyes. My sister used to sing that song, he said with a hoarse voice. Mary Sullivan. She sang it to her daughter every night. Grace opened her eyes and stared at him. For the first time since he'd seen her at the auction, Jack saw a glimpse of the girl he'd known years before. You knew my mother? She asked hesitantly. Knew her? Jack smiled through his tears. Mary was my sister, and you, my dear Grace, are my niece. What followed was a moment of absolute silence. Grace studied him intensely, as if trying to reconcile the man before her with distant fragments of memory. Jack remained motionless, letting her process the revelation at her own pace. Finally, she took a step toward him. Uncle Jack, she whispered, using a name she hadn't spoken in years. Yes, my girl. It's me. Grace ran into his arms then, sobbing as if all the pain and confusion of the past 3 years could finally be released. Jack held her tight, feeling how thin she had become, but also sensing the strength that still existed in that small body. I thought everyone was dead, she cried. I thought I was alone in the world. Never, my dear, never alone. I just didn't know where you were. They stood embraced in the dusty yard while the sun set over the distant mountains. Jack began telling Grace about his own journey, how he had left seeking riches in the gold fields, how he had failed in his goals, but how fate had brought him back exactly when she needed him. It was God's providence that brought us together, Grace said, touching the small cross she wore around her neck. I prayed to him every night, asking to find my family. In the days that followed, Grace began remembering more things. Small details of life on the homestead gradually returned. The taste of Mary's cornbread, the smell of horses in the stable, the sound of wind through the oak leaves in the yard. Jack shared his own memories, helping fill in the gaps in the family story. She told him about the 3 years at St. Catherine's Orphanage, run by strict nuns who gave little food and expected hard work from all the children. She had been rechristened as Hope because the nuns thought Grace was too secular a name. She learned to read and write, but also learned to hide when men visited the orphanage looking for domestic help. Why didn't you run away? Jack asked one evening as they dined by candlelight. Where would I go? Grace replied with wisdom too sad for her age. I didn't remember where my home was. I didn't even remember my real name until you helped me remember. Jack felt deep anger against the system that had failed his niece so completely. but he also felt immense gratitude for finding her before something worse happened. They began working together to restore the homestead. Grace proved surprisingly skilled with animals. She could calm nervous horses with ease and seemed to have a natural instinct for caring for chickens and goats. Jack realized that despite all the trauma, the strong Sullivan family spirit still lived in her. "We'll raise the finest horses in the territory," Jack said one morning, watching Grace train a young colt. "Like your father used to do. Will you teach me everything?" she asked, her eyes shining with hope. "Everything I know, my dear, and we'll learn together what we don't know." As weeks passed, the homestead began to come alive again. Jack had used his last dollars to buy some basic animals: 2 cows, a young bull, a dozen chickens, and 3 horses. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Grace flourished in the familiar environment. Her skin gained healthy color, her laughter gradually returned, and she began growing again after years of malnutrition. Most importantly, the distrust in her eyes was replaced by a cautious but genuine joy. One afternoon, while Jack was repairing the house roof, Grace came running from the field with unusual excitement. "Uncle Jack, come see what I found." She led him to a forgotten corner of the yard where vegetation had grown wild. There, half hidden among the weeds, was a small wooden cross marking a tiny grave. "It's Whiskers," Grace said softly, kneeling beside the cross. "My kitten. Mama buried her here when she died." Jack knelt beside his niece, touched by the tenderness of the memory. "Do you remember her?" "Now I do. She was all white except for a grey patch on her forehead. That's why Mama called her Whiskers." Grace touched the wooden cross lovingly. "I was so sad when she died, but Mama said she had gone to kitten heaven, where there was endless milk and fish to catch." "Your mother always knew what to say to make you feel better," Jack said. "Like you do." Grace looked at him with a shy smile. "You always know what to say, too." At that moment, Jack realized he had become more than just Grace's uncle. He had become her guardian, her protector, and perhaps the only true family she would ever know. The responsibility was intimidating, but also deeply rewarding. Neighbors began visiting the restored homestead, curious about Jack's return and intrigued by Grace's presence. Most vaguely remembered the epidemic and the family that had disappeared, and easily accepted the explanation that Grace had been found in a distant orphanage. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor who had been Mary's friend, was especially helpful. She brought seeds for a garden, taught Grace traditional recipes her mother used to make, and shared stories about life in the territory before the tragedy. "You have your mother's eyes, child," Mrs. Henderson said one afternoon while helping Grace make biscuits, "and the same kindness in your heart." Grace smiled shyly, but Jack noticed how she straightened with pride hearing the comparison. As autumn arrived, the homestead had transformed. The fields were being prepared for spring planting, the animals were healthy and reproducing, and the house had regained its welcoming atmosphere. Most importantly, Grace had reclaimed her identity and her place in the world. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Grace asked a question Jack had been expecting. "Uncle Jack, what will happen to me when I grow up?" Jack thought carefully before answering. "What do you want to happen?" "I want to stay here," she said without hesitation. "I want to take care of the homestead like Mama and Papa did. I want to have a family of my own someday, but I also want to take care of you when you get old." Jack smiled in the darkness. "Then that's what we'll do. This homestead is yours by right. It belonged to your parents, and now it's yours. I'll be here to help you for as long as you need me." "Forever?" Grace asked in a small voice. "Forever," Jack confirmed. But life rarely offers simple endings, and the story of Jack and Grace still held important chapters. In the winter of the 5th year after their reunion, a severe drought hit the region. Wells dried up, cattle grew thin, and many families began abandoning their land in search of better conditions. Jack watched with concern the sparse clouds on the horizon. The homestead's water reserve was diminishing rapidly, and he knew difficult decisions would need to be made. Grace, now 20 and pregnant with her first child, noticed the growing tension in her uncle's face. "We're in trouble, aren't we?" she asked one morning while preparing watered-down coffee. They had rationed even the coffee beans. Jack couldn't lie to her. "Yes, my dear. If it doesn't rain in the next few weeks, we might have to sell some animals and consider other options." Grace placed her hand protectively over her belly. "We won't give up this land. It's our heritage, our history. There must be a solution." That afternoon, while Jack inspected the main well, now almost dry, Grace had an idea. She vaguely remembered stories her father Thomas used to tell about natural springs hidden in the nearby hills. They were old legends, told by local Indians even before the settlers arrived in the territory. "Uncle Jack," she called, approaching carefully due to her pregnancy. "Do you remember the stories Papa used to tell about the three brothers' spring?" Jack stopped working and looked at her with interest. "The old legends? About three springs connected by underground channels?" "Exactly. Papa said our great-grandfather had found one of them when he established the homestead here, and that he had marked the location somehow." Together, they began searching for clues on the property. They rummaged through the house attic, finding dusty trunks full of old documents and family objects. Among yellowed papers and faded photographs, Grace discovered something extraordinary: a leather-bound diary written by her great-grandfather, Samuel Sullivan. The fragile pages told the story of the homestead's founding, but also contained crude maps and notes about water sources. One entry in particular caught their attention. August 15th, 1847, found the second spring of the ancients today. It's hidden behind the red rocks, where three juniper trees form a triangle. Mark the spot with an iron cross, buried 2 feet north of the largest stone. Jack and Grace looked at each other with renewed hope. The red rocks still existed on the property, and the juniper trees, though centuries old, would probably still be there. The next morning, despite Jack's worried protests about Grace's condition, they set out toward the hills. Grace's husband, Robert, had traveled to the state capital looking for work, so it was just the two of them on this crucial search. They found the red rocks easily. They were a distinctive formation that had served as a landmark in the region for generations. The three junipers were still there, enormous and twisted by time, their deep roots suggesting access to underground water. Jack began digging where the diary indicated, while Grace rested in the shade of the trees. The ground was hard as concrete due to the drought, but after 2 hours of hard work, Jack's shovel hit something metallic. It was a rusted iron cross, exactly as described in the diary. "It's here!" Jack shouted with excitement. "The marker is here!" They dug deeper around the cross, following the great-grandfather's detailed instructions. When they reached about 10 feet deep, the soil changed texture, becoming moister and darker. Then, like a miracle, water began to seep. First just a few drops, then a steady trickle, until it became a small, crystalline stream. Grace cried with joy and relief. "We did it, Uncle Jack! We found the spring!" Jack built a simple channeling system using stones and clay to direct the water toward the main homestead. Within days, they had abundant water not only for their own consumption and animals, but enough to irrigate a small garden and even share with needy neighbors. News of the spring's discovery spread quickly through the region. Families who were considering abandoning their land decided to stay. Jack and Grace became respected figures in the community, not only for their own perseverance, but for their generosity in sharing resources when others needed them. When Robert returned from the capital a few weeks later, he found the homestead transformed. There was green where once only dry earth existed, and an atmosphere of hope had replaced the despair he had left behind. "How did you manage this?" he asked in amazement, watching the flowing water and healthy animals. "With faith, family, and a little ancestral wisdom," Grace replied, smiling as she caressed her growing belly. The baby was born in early spring, when rains finally returned and the region turned green again. It was a girl, and they named her Mary, in honor of Grace's mother. Jack held his great niece in his arms for the first time and saw in her the same green eyes that had characterized Sullivan women for generations. "This little one will grow up hearing stories about magical springs and lost treasures," he said, rocking Mary gently. "And about uncles who crossed territories to save lost nieces," Grace added with a tired but radiant smile. As years passed, the homestead became an example of sustainability and community cooperation. The spring continued to flow abundantly, and Jack taught water conservation techniques to other farmers. Grace developed a reputation as a skilled midwife, helping other women in the region during difficult births. Little Mary grew up hearing stories of her family, about grandparents she never knew but whose love still echoed in family traditions, about a great uncle who never gave up searching, and about a mother who survived losing everything to rebuild an even stronger home. In the years that followed, the Sullivan homestead became much more than a simple rural property. It transformed into a symbol of hope for the entire region. Families who had lost everything came seeking guidance from Jack and Grace, knowing they would find not only practical advice about farming and animal husbandry, but also the living example that it was possible to rebuild a life after devastation. Jack established a small school on the property where he taught local children to read and write, using the same gentle and patient method he had employed to help Grace recover her memories. Mary was his most dedicated student, absorbing not only academic lessons but also the family stories Jack told to illustrate his teachings. "Grandpa," Mary asked one winter afternoon while practicing her writing, "will you write our story in a book?" Jack stopped correcting the other students' exercises and looked at his great niece. "Why would you like me to do that, little one?" "Because other people need to know that lost families can find each other again," she replied, with the simple wisdom of childhood. "And that when you truly love someone, it doesn't matter how much time passes or how far away they are." Inspired by Mary's words, Jack actually began writing. In the quiet nights by lamplight, he documented not only the story of how he had found Grace, but also the lessons learned about perseverance, faith, and the transformative power of unconditional love. Grace contributed her own memories, mainly about the difficult years in the orphanage and how the unexpected kindness of a stranger had completely changed the course of her life. The manuscript grew over the months, including Mary's traditional recipes that Grace had managed to remember, horse breeding techniques passed down through generations, and even detailed maps showing the location of other possible water sources in the region. It became a true record of American frontier life of that era, but always centered on the universal theme of family importance. When Mary turned 10, she announced that she wanted siblings. Grace and Robert had tried to have more children over the years, but without success. Instead of becoming sad about this limitation, they decided to expand their family in other ways. "Uncle Jack," Grace said one spring morning, "remember how you found me when I needed it most? Maybe it's our turn to do the same for other children." And so they began taking in orphaned or abandoned children from the region. First came Samuel, an 8-year-old boy whose parents had died in a flood. Then came the sisters Emma and Lucy, 6-year-old twins who'd been left at the local church. Each child brought their own story of pain, but also their own capacity for healing and joy. Jack discovered he was born to be a grandfather. His infinite patience, his ability to tell captivating stories, and his skill for making each child feel special transformed him into an almost legendary figure in the region. The children followed him everywhere, absorbing his teachings about the land, animals, and life. Mary naturally assumed the role of big sister, helping the new family members adapt. She taught Samuel to ride horses, helped Emma and Lucy with their lessons, and was always ready with a hug when someone missed the parents they had lost. "Our family is like our spring," she observed at a memorable dinner when the table was surrounded by 8 people, 3 generations united not only by blood, but by chosen love. "It started small, but now it feeds many people." Grace smiled at her daughter, recognizing in her the same intuitive wisdom that Mary had always demonstrated. And like our spring, our family will always have room for more love. Jack looked around the noisy table, full of laughter and overlapping conversations, and remembered the lonely nights in his mining cabin when he thought he would die alone and forgotten. Now, at 65, he was surrounded by more love than he had ever dreamed possible. That night, after all the children had gone to bed, Jack found Grace on the porch, as so many times before. She was pregnant again, a late miracle that had surprised the whole family. "Sometimes I wonder," she said, stroking her belly gently, "if Mama and Papa can see us from where they are." "I'm sure they can," Jack replied. "And I bet they're proud to see how you've transformed pain into love, losses into gains." "We transformed," Grace corrected. "You taught me that family isn't just about who shares your blood, but about who shares your heart." When the baby was born, a boy they named Thomas, in honor of Grace's father, the whole family gathered to welcome him. Mary held her little brother with reverence. Samuel promised to teach him to be brave, and the twins, Emma and Lucy, sang a lullaby they had learned from Grace. Jack, holding the newborn great-nephew, saw in him not only the continuation of the Sullivan lineage, but also the promise that the love they had so carefully cultivated would continue to grow and spread for future generations. As the years rolled on like the endless Montana sky, the Sullivan homestead became a beacon of hope that drew people from across the territory. Word spread about the family who had overcome impossible odds, about the man who had bought back his own blood, and about the spring that never ran dry, even in the worst droughts. When Mary turned 16, she made a discovery that would add another layer to their family's remarkable story. While exploring the old root cellar during spring cleaning, she found a tin box hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in her great-grandmother's hand. They were love letters exchanged between her great-grandparents during their courtship, but more importantly, they contained detailed descriptions of other homesteaders in the area, including families who had simply vanished during various hardships. "Grandpa Jack," Mary said breathlessly, running to him with the letters clutched in her hands, "I think some of the children we've taken in might have family out there. Real family, like you found me." Jack examined the faded ink with wonder. The letters mentioned the Henderson family, the Blackwoods, the Clearys, names that matched some of the surnames their adopted children had whispered in their sleep, fragments of memories they thought were lost forever. That summer, Jack and Grace embarked on what they called the Great Search. Using the letters as a guide, they traveled to distant settlements and frontier towns, following leads that were decades old. Samuel, now a strong young man of 20, insisted on joining them. "If someone's looking for me," he said simply, "I want to be found." Their first breakthrough came in a town called Willowbrook, 2 days' ride south. An elderly storekeeper named Josiah Cleary nearly fainted when he saw Samuel. "Dear God in heaven," he whispered, reaching out with trembling hands, "you look just like my brother did at that age. We thought the whole family perished in the flood of 58. Samuel had an uncle he'd never known existed. More than that, he had cousins, a sprawling family that had given up hope of finding any survivors from his branch of the family tree. The reunion was tearful and joyous, but Samuel made it clear that the Sullivans would always be his primary family. "Uncle Josiah," he said firmly, "I'm grateful to know you exist, but Jack Sullivan saved my life and raised me. Nothing changes that." Emma and Lucy's story proved even more remarkable. Following clues from the letters, they discovered that their parents hadn't abandoned them at the church, as everyone believed. Their father had been a traveling preacher who died of pneumonia while on a mission trip, and their mother had left them at the church with a note explaining she was dying of consumption and begging the congregation to care for her daughters until her sister could come for them. The sister had indeed come, but a miscommunication had led her to believe the girls had already been placed with a family and taken west. The reunion between the twins and their Aunt Sarah took place in the Sullivan parlor on a crisp October evening. Aunt Sarah, now a widow herself, wept as she held the grown women who had been children when she last saw them. But like Samuel, Emma and Lucy made it clear that while they were grateful to reconnect with their birth family, the Sullivans were their true home. "We've learned," Grace observed to Jack that night, "that families can be like rivers. They split and flow in different directions, but they all carry the same water." These reunions brought unexpected gifts. Uncle Josiah turned out to be a skilled blacksmith who taught Samuel trades that would serve the homestead well. Aunt Sarah brought with her a collection of books and musical instruments that enriched the cultural life of their growing community. Most importantly, these connections created a network of families across the territory who looked out for each other, shared resources during hard times, and celebrated each other's joys. As Jack's 70th birthday approached, the entire extended Sullivan family, blood relatives, adopted children, and the families they'd helped reunite, gathered for a celebration that lasted 3 days. The modest homestead couldn't hold everyone, so they set up a camp by the spring, with tents and wagons spread across the meadow like a small town. On the evening of Jack's birthday, as he sat by the campfire surrounded by more family than one man had any right to expect, young Thomas, now 5 years old, climbed onto his lap with a serious expression. "Great Uncle Jack," the boy said solemnly, "Mama says you're the reason we're all here." Jack chuckled and ruffled the child's hair. "Well, Thomas, I think we're all the reason we're all here. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Will you tell me the story again?" Thomas asked, "about how you found Mama at the auction?" As Jack began the familiar tale, he noticed that the conversations around the campfire gradually quieted. Adults and children alike turned to listen, even though they'd all heard the story countless times. But there was something in Jack's voice that night, a deeper understanding of the miracle they'd all been part of. "The funny thing about that day," Jack said, his voice carrying across the quiet meadow, "is that I thought I was buying a stranger. I had no idea I was bringing my own family home, but I've learned that sometimes love recognizes what the mind can't see. My heart knew Grace belonged with me before my eyes recognized her face." Grace, now a respected matriarch with silver threading through her dark hair, reached over and squeezed his weathered hand. "And I've learned that families aren't just born, they're chosen every single day. Every morning we wake up and decide to love each other. That's when we become family all over again." As the fire burned low and the Montana stars wheeled overhead, 3 generations of Sullivans, biological and chosen, settled in for the night. The spring continued its eternal song, the same water that had sustained the land for generations, now flowing toward a future bright with promise. And so this story of the American frontier truly ends, where destiny united what tragedy had separated, proving that sometimes the greatest riches come disguised as small daily miracles, waiting to be recognized by hearts willing to love unconditionally. A story that demonstrates that true love not only survives life's storms, it flourishes through them, creating gardens where once there was only desert, and that a family can grow not only through birth, but through the conscious choice to open our hearts to those who need a home. In the end, Jack Sullivan discovered that true wealth was not in the gold mines he had sought in his youth, but in the golden mines of the human heart, where love multiplies every time it is shared, and where every act of kindness creates ripples that can heal generations of broken hearts. Years later, when Jack's hair had turned white as Montana snow, and his steps had slowed to match the peaceful rhythm of the spring, he would sit on that same porch where he had first heard Grace's story. Visitors often asked him about the secret to building such a remarkable family from such broken pieces. "There's no secret," he would say, his eyes twinkling with the wisdom of 8 decades. "Just remember that every person you meet is somebody's lost child, and every kindness you show might be the miracle they've been praying for. Sometimes the family you're meant to have isn't the one you were born into. It's the one you choose to build, one heart at a time. Indeed, and on quiet evenings, when the Montana wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the spring sang its eternal song, you could still hear echoes of children's laughter mixing with the gentle voices of those who had learned that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you create with love, patience, and the courage to believe that broken things can always be made whole again.